So we start talking about special senses, which means we start our conversation about the eye. We will start with vision. So there's going to be a good deal of anatomy on it, and physiology as well. We will start with the structure of the eye, and we'll go from external eye structures to the muscles of the eye to the eye bulb. Eye is a sphere, and it's pretty solid sphere. You can't take the eye out from an animal or a person, and it will stay intact, at least for a while. It's about an inch in diameter. Why we focus so much on the vision? About 70% of all sensory receptors are in the eye. So you receive the majority of the sensory input from your eyes. Actually, but only a small anatomical portion of the eye is involved in sensory reception. Out of that ball with the diameter of 1 inch, only a small part, the retina, is actually involved in getting the image, transduction of the image. Bones, multiple bones, frontal, lacrimal, nasal, ethmoid, sphenoid, maxillary, and temporal, and zygomatic will protect the eye. They will form the orbit. Fat will also pad the eye. In terms of external structures, eyebrows will prevent sweat getting into the eye. Okay. And then you have eyelids, which are pretty important anatomical portions. They're also called palpebrae. So that space between the eyelids, or that line that you can see when somebody else closes the eyes, is called palpebral fissure. Okay, the space between the palpebrae. This part is called medial commissure. That's the angle, the point where superior and inferior palpebrae, or upper and lower eyelids, meet. And another place where they meet is lateral commissure. In the eyelids, you can find tarsal plates. Tarsal plates essentially connect two muscles, orbicularis oris, the circular muscle around the eye, and levator palpebrae superioris, that open and close eyelids. That's why you can blink and wink, because of those two muscles. So blinking is the reflexive movement. Okay, its function is to lubricate the eye surface. There are several secretions produced that participate in that lubrication. One of them is the secretion from the tarsal glands. It's oily, okay, and it prevents eyelids from sticking. There is saline that is produced mostly in the form of tears. And then there's mucus. Mucus is produced by the layer of cells known as conjunctiva. Conjunctiva surrounds most of the anterior surface of the eye, and also the interior surface of the palpebrae. If you will flip the eyelids out or pull them out, what you see is conjunctiva. That pink layer is conjunctiva. Okay, so this is shown here, the conjunctiva. Eyelashes. The main function is to sense if something gets closer to the eye. There's a lot of innervations. Eyelashes are hairs, right? And hairs are anchored in follicles. So these follicles are innervated really well. And when something touches the eyelashes, you blink, right? a little gland here in the corner, sort of an interesting factoid, called lacrimal caruncle, produces the, I don't know how to explain, pretty much solid secretion that solidifies overnight, called Sandman's eye sand. Its function is not exactly known, it just produces that yellowish, little yellowish crumbles that you have in the corner of your eye. It's called Sandman's eye sand. So going back to conjunctiva. The layer of conjunctiva, you can see it's transparent right here in the picture, okay? It covers the anterior portion of the eye and the inner portion of the eyelids. The space on the eye that is not covered by conjunctiva, essentially the cornea, okay? That's the place on the eye where light comes through. Does it make sense? Conjunctiva doesn't cover cornea, and cornea in turn is the patch of the outer layer of the eye that is over the pupil and the iris. Conjunctiva can be bulbar, the one that's on the eyeball, and palpebral. Palpebral conjunctiva, palpebral conjunctiva, covers the interior surfaces of the palpebrae. Does that make sense? Essentially, when I pull it out, okay, and you see that pink layer, that's palpebral conjunctiva. Okay? And between these two layers, between palpebral conjunctiva and bulbar conjunctiva, is conjunctival sac. So inferior and superior conjunctival sac, that's where you place the contact lenses. Does that make sense? Just anatomically. Any questions on the anatomy? To be able to identify these anatomical parts, okay? Two parts of the conjunctiva, conjunctival sac, palpebral fissure, medial and lateral, medial and lateral commissure. What else did we talk about? Well, eyebrows, obviously. Okay. Now, lacrimal gland, that's pretty interesting, is located in the lateral, and it is superior to the eye, and it's closer to the lateral aspect, closer to the lateral commissure. Okay. Produces the secretion known as tears, lacrimal secretion. By the way, do you remember which cranial nerve controls the lacrimal secretion? Lacrimal secretion, is that a motor response or sensory? It will be motor, right? Because something is going on. You don't sense anything, you just produce things. Does that make sense? So it's motor. Is that somatic or visceral? Visceral. If it's visceral, which system is responsible for visceral responses? That's autonomic, but parasympathetic, yes. So if I say cranial nerves, which four nerves are carrying parasympathetic fibers? Facial. Nope. Facial, vagus, oculomotor, glossopharyngeal. Oculomotor, does it deal with the lacrimal secretion? No, it doesn't. Glossopharyngeal? No, it doesn't. Vagus? No, it doesn't. It's facial nerve. Glands on the face, nasal glands, lacrimal gland, and two salivary glands are all controlled by facial nerve. It's going to be facial. That makes sense? Your tears consist mostly of water. Okay? A little bit of salt, They also contain antibodies and the antibacterial protein called lysozyme. The story of discovery, lysozyme can be found in two secretions of the face, lacrimal secretion and nasal secretion, what your nasal glands producing. The history of discovery of lysozyme, there are two versions. One version is romantic, another one is not. A romantic version is that the lab assistant was sad when he was opening the plate with growing bacteria, and he shed tears, and one of those tears dropped into the bacterial culture, and lysozyme that was in tears started to kill bacteria. Not romantic version of that story says that he wasn't shedding tears. He had runny nose, and a drop of the snot went directly into the bacterial culture and killed the bacteria. So tears, not only, they don't lubricate the eye that much, their function is to wash whatever dust and anything that gets on the surface of the eye is being washed by the tears. Okay, since it may not only be dust but also bacteria and viruses and whatnot, tears contain lysozyme, antibacterial, and antibodies that are responsible for immune recognition and destruction of whatever pathogens end up on the eye surface. Tears then reach the medial commissure and drain through the lacrimal punctum. Punctum means like perforation, and lacrimal canaliculi, into the nasolacrimal duct, which enters the nasal cavity. Okay? If you cry a lot, you produce a lot of tears. Those tears enter through the nasolacrimal duct into the nasal cavity, and you have sniffles. If your nose is totally plugged, like you have really stuffed nose, right here, nasolacrimal duct will get plugged too, and then drainage of tears will be impaired. Does that make sense? You will have like watery eyes. Okay, do you see the link? Well, let's talk about external eye muscles. Don't have the modal close enough. Well, too bad for me. 6 external eye muscles. They control the movements of the eyeball. There are 4 rectus muscles that originate so-called common tendinous ring, and 2 oblique muscles. Now, rectus muscles, they move eye in the same direction as their names suggest. Here, for instance, you can see the lateral rectus muscle. How do you know what muscle does? Any muscle. What do you need to do? So again, that would be a good way to do it, but it's also very inhumane. I'm talking about the picture. Like you see it on the picture, the muscle, okay? You see that muscle originates in a tendinous ring, and its insertion site is the eyeball. How do you know what's going to happen to the eyeball? How do you know what this muscle does to the eyeball? What do you have to do? You have to hypothetically pull on that muscle. Shorten it and see what happens. Does that make sense? So if you shorten that rectus muscle, what's going to happen to the eyeball? Where it's going to move? It will move out. Does that make sense? If this is right eye, it will be to the right. If this is left, well, this is not left eye, but if we would see left eye, it would move to the left. Does that make sense to you? If lateral rectus moves the eye outward, what would medial rectus do? Move it inward. I'm trying to say, okay, there's medial rectus, okay? Move it inward. So this. That's effort from the medial rectus muscle. Okay? Superior rectus. Only up. Muscle can only pull. Okay. So superior rectus will move up. Inferior rectus will move it down. So that's pretty simple, right? Rectus muscles move the eye in the direction that their name says. Superior rectus up, inferior rectus down, lateral rectus outward, medial rectus inward. We got it? Two oblique muscles. There's a superior oblique and inferior oblique. This is superior oblique. It is attached to the superior aspect of the eyeball via the pulley. You see this pulley? This pulley is called trochlea. Guess which cranial nerve innervates superior oblique? Trochlear. Yes. So, by pulling superior oblique, where do you think the eye will go? Diagonal. Which diagonal? Outward and down. Actually down. As you pull on the upper part of the eye, it will move a little down. Okay? You kind of pull the outside part of the eye up, so the iris, the pupil, will look down. So superior oblique out and down, and inferior oblique. Can you see the inferior oblique right here? That's inferior oblique. Inferior oblique will move the eye out and up. We have 6 muscles. I expect you to know the function for each of them. It's not that hard. Does that make sense? What if one of your muscles, eye muscles, doesn't work? How do you call it in layman's terms? Lazy eye. Yep, that's lazy eye. There are 2 reasons for lazy eye, major reasons, major, okay? Weak muscle or paralyzed muscle, okay? Also uncoordinated muscles will lead to lazy eye. So if muscle is paralyzed, which cranial nerves may be dysfunctional that will lead to the paralysis of the muscles? Which 3 nerves control eye muscles? Oculomotor, trochlear, abducens, yes. Now, abducens nerve controls the lateral rectus. And the word abducens comes from the word, well, it's the other way around actually. It has the same root as the word abduction. When you abduct something, you take it away. Abducens nerve, when stimulated, stimulates rectus, lateral rectus, and eye looks outward, looks away. Does that make sense? So for instance, if abducens nerve is damaged, where would eye look? Inside, right? If there is no pulling action on the outside of the eye will immediately go inwards. You have to understand that those muscles, they constantly have a tone. They aren't relaxed. Normally, they aren't relaxed. Okay, they are at a certain basal level of stimulation. If I want to look up, superior rectus will be additionally stimulated and will move the eye up. Does it make sense to you? Good. Now, there are many types of strabismus. A lot of it, makes good sense. Exotropia, outwards, esotropia, inwards, hypotropia, down, hypertropia, up. I'm not asking the types of strabismus. I want you to understand what strabismus is. Okay, where does it come from? What is the reason? And when you have eyes that, and think about this, bless you, think about this. The eye, the lazy eye, does it still see? Yes. So now you have two eyes that are not focusing on the same aspect of the picture. Does that make sense? So you have double vision. It's called diplopia. Some neurological disorders can cause diplopia, and also, pretty famously, severe alcohol intoxication. Really severe. You have to be royally drunk to have diplopia, alcohol-induced diplopia. How can you treat it? If it's paralysis, you can't. Is everybody fine there? You can just close the door. So if it's, think about this, if it's paralysis, you can treat it. But if it's a weak muscle, then you can. All you have to do is, you have to put a patch on a healthy eye. So you're kind of forcing your weak eye to start moving around properly. And you can train those muscles. Okay? Interesting thing, when there is a paralysis, okay, then eventually brain will compensate for inability to focus. Not so much compensate, but think about this. You have one eye that moves perfectly fine. And then you have another that is not completely functional or dysfunctional. The person may develop so-called functional blindness. The eye is still completely fine. I mean, it receives sensory information, it sends sensory information to the brain, but that sensory information is filtered out. That's called functional blindness. Any questions? Functional blindness? I think it can be cured, yeah. So if the signals come back, start to come back normally, it can be reversed.
Because I've heard guys just that are constantly looking through, the scope.
Uh-huh.
And they gotta sit for hours. Then after a while, after they get done with that rotation, they're having problems with the other eye.
Oh yeah, because it's a filtering information away in the brain. It's thalamus that kind of says no, it's not relevant. Now the eyeball. It's a sphere, right? So it can be divided into aspects and chambers. Okay? Aspect, segments, there are many words. So this part of the eyeball is called anterior pole. This part of an eyeball is called posterior pole. Lens, which here, separate eye into the anterior segment and posterior segment. Does that make sense? Just terminology. Okay? Posterior segment is filled with vitreous humor. Anterior segment is filled with aqueous humor. Vitreous humor is gel-like thing, gel-like substance that's produced during embryonic development and stays in person's eye for life. There's no fluid exchange there, just stays there. Does that make sense? There are many functions to the vitreous humor, transmission of light. Okay, it supports lens. So don't just fall back. Okay, it supports them, and it presses the neural layer of the retina against the pigmented layer of the retina. We didn't talk about those layers yet, but it pretty much makes sure that retina is anatomically intact, solid, and there are no structural alterations to it. Okay? One of its contribution is intraocular pressure. Think about this. You have 6 eye muscles that are constantly pulling on the eyeball. If there would be no pressure from the inside, the eyeball would just collapse. Think about the eye as the little ball that is partially filled with a thing like jello. The jello resists the pulling pressure of the extrinsic eye muscles. Anterior segment, as I mentioned, is filled with the aqueous humor, which is produced in the ciliary processes here. There are capillaries in these processes. They produce the humor. Now, anterior segment can be divided further into two chambers, and to make it even more confusing, anterior segment is divided into anterior chamber and posterior chamber. Let me draw a little picture of the eyeball, okay? Again, my drawing skills are not perfect. So that's hypothetical eyeball, okay? That is lens. That's posterior segment. That's anterior segment. Does that make sense? This is iris, the blue line. Iris divides the anterior segment into the anterior chamber and posterior chamber. Does that make sense? Okay. So the aqueous humor. Ciliary capillaries, right here, produce that fluid, by filtering plasma of the blood. Some of it goes a little bit into the vitreous humor, but minimally. Most of it flows from the posterior chamber through the pupil into the anterior chamber. In the anterior chamber, there are openings called scleral venous sinuses. Sinus is like a tiny vein, okay? And that's where the fluid goes away. Does that make sense? Think about this. The ciliary processes are like faucets that produce fluid. Scleral venous sinus is a drain where this fluid goes away. Does that make sense? The function of the fluid, also intraocular pressure, and also the supply of oxygen and nutrients to structures like lens and cornea. Now, we didn't talk about it yet, but can you tell me, when the light enters the eye, based on this picture, what would it go through? How would it go? What would it cross? Which structures first? Cornea, then pupil, and then lens, right? Cornea and lens have no blood supply. They receive nutrients and oxygen from aqueous humor. Why? They don't have any blood supply. There are no blood vessels in cornea and lens. Exactly, we would see the blood vessels, so we don't need blood vessels in the structures. Does that make sense? That's why we gotta have aqueous humor. What's going to happen if aqueous humor doesn't drain properly? What's going to happen to the amount of aqueous humor in the anterior segment? It will, say, too much, build up. No, not really. It would be lovely, actually. I would love to see that, but no explosion. Glaucoma, yes. The condition is called glaucoma. Yes. It's probably a dysfunction of autonomic nervous system. There are two muscles that go around the pupil. One is sphincter pupillae, and one is dilator pupillae. Sphincter pupillae is controlled by parasympathetic, dilator is sympathetic. If there is an imbalance, I can imagine, or fibers are damaged, and muscle is not constricted or dilated, either of those, in the proper way, then I can imagine getting squashed from either side. Yeah. We're going to wrap it up, so it's finished. Yeah, your question? I don't know if mice on glaucoma, the only treatment, well, reasonable treatment for glaucoma is to dilate the scleral venous sinus. So I believe marijuana probably will dilate it, but I don't know if cannabinoids can do that. I need to check.